Motives and duties. Following last week's discussion of consequentialism, this week we will learn about and discuss deontology. Deontology, it's a second moral or ethical theory, just like consequentialism. And don't let the fancy word, discourage you. Think when you see Dayon, just think duty, like moral duties, moral obligations, things that we're obliged to do by morality itself. And one should be okay with it. It's like Dayon, it's just a fancy word for something like duty, moral obligation. Um, that's why we are talking about motives and duties when we're talking about deontology. Deontology is it will provide us with answers to these two questions from last week, just like consequentialism did. Remember the context. We looked at and surveyed the meta-ethical positions like moral relativism, moral objectivism, all of those. We've talked through those, worked with them, and then we said, okay, well, those positions give us an indication of who we ultimately answer to as far as morality is concerned. Like at the end of the day, is my peer group the ultimate judges of whether I did something right or wrong? Or at the end of the day, is it just me, myself, and I? Am I the only judge? Etc. Or is it something more, like a we plus, something more than just peer groups, but not something so far out as, say, a divine being or a pantheon of divine beings? That would be more in accord with moral absolutism. But we've talked through those. Everybody should be familiar with those at this point. And last week we said, okay, so now that we may have a handle on who do we ultimately answer to, wouldn't it be awesome to have answers to these two questions? Like, okay, so now I know who I answer to, who my judge is. Well, what does my judge actually want me to do? So when is a specific action or a rule or a law or a committee policy, when is that thing moral or immoral? And essentially, what would the moral judge, the ultimate judges, approve of, and what would they discourage? What would they say? No, that's bad, or yes, that's good. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, okay, so if I could, so if it's kind of like someone could just tell you, yeah, these are the good things to do, these are the bad things to do, but we need to be able to determine that for ourselves on the fly. It's like we need an indicator or some metric or some way, some moral compass to point us in the right direction when we're confronted with situations that we may not immediately know the answer to. So when is a specific action or rule moral or immoral? Well, we need a reliable way to accurately figure that out over and over and over again throughout life and various interactions with other people. Well, that's exactly what consequentialism and deontology are supposed to do for us. They're supposed to provide us with answers to these two questions. And recall that with consequentialism, the short story is that an action or a rule is moral or immoral with consequentialism as long as it results in consequences that the overall most people affected were made better off by it. So one's action is morally good insofar as it did the best by the most people affected by the action. Then we saw how that works. How do we determine that for consequentialism? Well, we gather up all the results of an action. So say that Bob steals something, and we want to ask, okay, did Bob do something morally good or morally bad? Well, according to the consequentialist, the way we can determine that always, every single time, is we just collect up the consequences. Like, how did Bob's theft impact Bob, the person who did the stealing? Moreover, how did it impact the person that Bob stole from? How did it affect that person's family? How did the action affect Bob's family? How did it affect the majority of people that were impacted by it, did they experience a positive increase overall? Like if Bob's theft impacted, fairly directly, say 10 people, Bob and his family, and then the person that Bob stole from and their family, let's just assume it was limited to say 10 total people. Well, if say 8 of those people were actually made better off by Bob's theft in some kind of way, and a person just can think through that and come up with a scenario where maybe it did make everybody better off. And at that case, the consequentialist would say that Bob's action was moral. But what we're doing is it's that empirical sort of approach where we actually look at the observable, measurable, calculatable consequences of an action and then just tally the results, like last time with the bar charts and stuff, where we have to be able, though, to assign the positives and the negatives, or the benefits and the detractions. And that's a little tough in some cases. It could be extremely tough if we're dealing with stuff like preventative wars and these big scale that affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It could become extremely overwhelming. But the beauty of consequentialism, its biggest selling point, is that it always returns a definitive answer. Was this action moral or immoral? Or would a certain action, if we're projecting to the future, would that action be moral or immoral? Consequentialists can give us answers to questions like that. No wishy-washy stuff. It's just straightforward, yes or no. Or if it turns out that everybody's equally benefited and equally negated, so that in a sense everything balances out, it's just neutral. You can look back at last week's video of a bar graph of how that might happen, and that would just be a case of an action that's neutral. It's morally neutral. So an action, always in ethics and morality, it could be morally good, it could be morally bad, or it could be morally indeterminate. And the indeterminate action is one that it's neither good nor bad to do. It really makes no difference whether you do it at all. But that is still an answer to the question. Is this good or bad to do? Well, it's neither. And so you can do it or not. There's no loss or no gain from doing it. And that's the way it is. But in many cases, we could see an overall increase in the well-being of the majority of people affected, or an overall decrease in their well-being or pleasure or their happiness, or whatever sort of things or notions or states of being we want to assign as the positive. And there's some wiggle room, lots of wiggle room in consequentialism when it comes to what actually is a positive or a benefit versus like what is a pro of an action, a positive consequence versus a negative consequence. And there's some wiggle, as everyone saw last week. But the core values with consequentialism is always the good of the whole, the best for the most. That what matters the most is the state of being of the most people affected. It's better for an individual to sacrifice themselves in order to make the world a better place for others, or to make the situation come out best for others. The consequentialists, they're realistic in that regard. Like, maybe it's not possible to make everybody happy all the time. So that means that some of the time, some people are not going to be happy as a result of various actions. But that's okay on consequentialism as long as the action resulted in the best overall happiness for the most people. If some people suffer terribly because of this action, but the majority of others benefited by this action, then that action would be perfectly morally okay on a consequentialist picture. And we talked through various examples of that last week. And so just the sort of Antonym to this good of the whole would be something like hardcore selfishness. That's a core disvalue of consequentialism. Is consequentialists are all about doing the best for the most, not necessarily the best for the individual. Like individuals only count as one. They get one little bar in the bar chart. They get no more than one bar. And so everybody, it's like a massively equal playing field when it comes to assessing the overall positive and negative of an action. That no one person stands out in consequentialism. Everybody is one and no more than one when it comes to the counting and the calculating of the, positives and negatives of the action. And one of those values also, the core value of consequentialism, is they're trying to make ethical decision making and ethical judgments and evaluations more empirical, more scientific, where we can actually go out into the world and observe and collect data and test that data and form hypotheses and then look for support for that based off doing more data, more testing, more experimenting, so that we have that consequentialism can leverage the power of something like a scientific method. They can, and there's an extreme amount of strength in consequentialism because of that. And that, everyone knows that with science, the beauty of science is we record what's going on, and then we get to actually do some math on that data and then build mathematical models of the situation, and we can make decisions based off those models. It doesn't mean we're always going to get the right answer or even the best answer, but typically some sort of method is better than no method at all. And the scientific method tends to be one that's held true in terms of adding to our knowledge base in time. And that's what consequentialism hopes to turn ethics into. It's suggesting that if we want to make ethics more science-like, a sort of science of morality, where we can test and retest and hypothesize and all that stuff, consequentialism says, well, we're the way to go. And what makes it especially ethical is that by doing the best for the most, that it always is going to result in minimizing the harm for the most. That's how it becomes an especially ethical or moral theory. And so one of their disvalues is going to be, non-empirical methods. An example of that would be people who want to make moral decisions based off of a gut feeling, off of a conscience. And we'll see today with deontology, we're kind of going back to more non-empirical methods. So in many ways, consequentialism and deontology, they are not necessarily very friendly theories together. But we will see as we go along. The strengths of consequentialism is that objectivity, also that simplicity of it. That all we have to do is, after an action happens or before it happens, is try to tally up the consequences, assign the values, the pros, the cons of it, and then see how that affected the most people. If the most came out the best because of it, we have an answer. Even if the most came out the worst because of the action, we have an answer. That's extremely straightforward. It may not be simple to assign those numbers, but it's not always easy to assign numbers to your variables in any scientific endeavor. We have to develop tools to do that. And so, but don't let the difficulty of assigning the numbers does not take away from the overall simplicity and straightforwardness. We look at the consequences, we do some calculation, we get an answer. That's nice to have in a theory, especially dealing with ethics and morality. Consequentialism is also one of its strengths is its impartiality. Everyone counts as one and no more than one. It's like a massively equal playing field when it comes to assessing actions. No one has a privileged place in the calculation. Also, it has flexibility because it's looking at the consequences, real-time consequences of an action. It can adapt to any circumstance. There's no situation that you can't look at the outcomes and results of an action and start doing some numbering. That's nice. That's a strength. The weaknesses are, as we discussed, calculation problems. Like, in fact, do we calculate all the consequences of like wars or even simple situations where it's like with, say, an abortion. Sometimes it's not so easy to necessarily assign perfectly clean numbers to all these things. But maybe that's no more difficult than it is in any other scientific endeavor. And integrity, human rights. See, consequentialism does not immediately say that people have rights. It doesn't immediately guarantee that everybody's rights would be respected at any given time. In consequentialism, if it turned out that the calculation result is that the majority's made better off by the few losing certain rights, then consequentialism would go along with it. It'd be, yep, that may be the most moral course of action. That doesn't sit well with some people. So that can be a potential weakness. And also integrity. Sometimes consequentialism might require that we sacrifice one in the group in order to do the best for the most that remain in the group. Some people would say that, well, how can I remain and still be me even after I've done such a thing? That's an integrity style concern about consequentialism. But as noted last week, consequentialism has responses for all of these objections. So it's far from defeated, even though it does have weaknesses. And the structure of consequentialist argument, this is just one of the structures. You can look back through last week's handout for all of them, but it is an extremely straightforward structure where this is a way you can always build a consequentialist style argument. Is you start out with assuming consequentialism is true. That's what that first premise does, or that first reason. Number one is if an action results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected by it, then it's moral. Then what you have to do is establish that, yep, in fact, that action does result in the best overall consequences. And then by 1 and 2, it will follow every time that the action was moral. But keep in mind that a person has to buy into consequentialism, premise 1, in order for this to work. And they have to do the number crunching and collecting the consequences to support the truth of 2, premise 2. So neither of these two premises are necessarily easy to support in practice, but if one can support them, then they have built a valid consequentialist argument, and it will be an extremely strong argument, especially if they have a lot of really good data for 2. It will at least be a testable argument. That there will be data that can be, analyzed and shared amongst many people and passed around and scrutinized, etc. So that's the structure of a consequentialist argument. That's the review of consequentialism. Deontology. Excuse me. Deontology, just like consequentialism, is a form of moral objectivism. As the sort of little summation thing I've done of it is, it's a form of we plus. A person may wonder, why are we just looking at these two like moral objectivist theories? Well, because they're the two biggest ones, and they're the ones that are ever present. Even when people don't think they're moral objectivists, they tend to assume things like moral objectivism, namely that there's something beyond groups, just our peer groups, that determines whether something's right or wrong. In most every article we'll read the rest of the semester and scenario, some people within it will be assuming some version of moral objectivism, and typically some version of consequentialism or deontology. And as we talk through deontology, people in here will begin to see that, yeah, they've heard of this stuff before. So, to understand deontology, we'll look back at this diagram we saw last week, this little stick figure picture, and The big difference between consequentialist and deontology is that when it comes to assessing the morality of this action, was this a good or a bad or a neutral action, consequentialists say all we need to look to is this pool of people over here, and the individual, the agent or the actor is part of this because they have consequences that whip back around to them too. According to consequentialism, we just look at the consequences. And then we tally them up, and as long as the greatest number of these people were made better off by it, it was good. If the greatest number of people over here were made worse off by this action, then it was bad. But in terms of moral assessment and evaluation, all we need to look to is over here for consequentialists. For deontology people, it goes the other way around. That we don't look at the consequences. The deontologist really doesn't care a whole lot about the consequences of an action. They would claim that this action, what makes it moral or immoral, happens before it ever happens. Over here in the desires, the motives, the intents, the values, the disvalues, the decision-making process, and all of that mental, inside the head stuff. What's happening in this agent's head and what motivated them, their intent, like why they did what they did. That is what dictates the morality of this action. That dictates whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, is why they did it in the first place. As well as certain actions on the deontological picture are just inherently bad. Like disrespectful actions, regardless of the intent or the motive, would be considered bad on a deontology picture. And we'll see that. But so for deontologists, we have to look this direction. Sometimes consequentialism is thought of as a forward looking, like it goes from the action and looks out to the consequences to the right hand side to determine was it a good or a bad action. The consequentialists don't really care what happened, what the action was, they just care what it resulted in. Deontology people are like, whoa, we need to look at the action and what drove it, what governed it, the motives, the intent, like why that person did what they did. That is where we are to look to decide, was this a good or a bad action for deontology. So I'll say that once again so that everybody gets that picture that deontology people look to these two things. This, what was going on in the person's head, and then the action itself. Those two things put together determine the morality or immorality of the action. Whereas with consequentialists, we don't have to care about what someone did. We don't have to care why they did it. We just have to care how it affected the majority of people. That's the big difference between these two theories. And so, deontology, what is their core line? Remember with consequentialism, it was do the best for the most. As long as you're doing that, and that's all, and that's the result of an action, you're morally good. You've done the right thing. Whereas with deontology people, it's always respect persons. That is what, if we do it, then we've supposedly done something morally okay. If we are demonstrating respect for persons. But notice that it's not just any old persons. We have to be very careful about, see these two little scare quotes, these quotation marks around persons, that has a very precise meaning for deontologists. Namely, persons is equal to rational, willing, autonomous, moral agents. We have to be clear about that. Everyone does in order to understand deontology. That persons for deontology are essentially adult human beings that have the ability to think and reason and, do problem solving, critical analysis. They have to have that ability, as well as they have to have the ability to create their own projects in life and will those things into being, like to develop a plan of action, say that I want to like a person could easily develop a plan like, okay, as my career, I want to be a person that works for a particular corporation, or I want to be a nurse, or I want to be an engineer, or I want to be a doctor, whatever. A rational, willing person can not only determine how best to try to achieve that goal, but also will it into being. That person can say, okay, I want to be a doctor, so I'll need to go to medical school. That means I don't have the money for medical school, so I need to get some student loans, and I need to figure out how to navigate that with my family responsibilities, and on and on and on. And then once we develop that plan, a rational, willing, autonomous agent can will that into being. They actually implement the plan. They go to the loan office, they talk to the people, they set up the loan, the payment schedule, how that's going to work. They register for classes, they go to classes, they will those things into being. They make them real. That's what that notion of willing is. They say, I want this to happen, and then they do what's involved in making it happen. That's willing. Autonomous Autonomy is big in many, many, many medical situations, as well as most situations, where an autonomous individual is one that has the freedom to decide for themselves. They're not being coerced. They're not being manipulated. Autonomy depends on making an informed decision. Like in medical fields, we come across this notion of informed consent. Like the patient is provided with the information necessary, like the potential upsides and downsides of a surgery, for example. Say a patient goes in and the doctor says, yeah, you really need this surgery. But before the patient signs the dotted line or agrees to the surgery, they're given the information about, okay, this is, if everything goes right, this is the steps that will occur, the events, the stages. This is what we do, and this is how it plays out. Here's what you do. Here's what we do as a medical staff. And here's what you can expect. Here's your patient education, what you'll need to do post-surgery. Here's what we'll do for you post-surgery. You're provided with all that information, and also with, well, here's how it could go wrong. Like, here's the potential downsides of this surgery. Or if it's, for example, something like chemotherapy or radiation treatment for a cancer, a person is informed that, yeah, there could be negative side effects of this particular line of treatment. And that is what the information that is necessary for an autonomous individual to give consent. Like, the person is not giving informed consent if they don't have all the information necessary to actually weigh the pros and cons in their mind. So autonomy depends on being free to make informed decisions, or having the ability to control your decision making in the best possible way for you or for others based off of having access to information. But it's also, it's at the core of autonomy is this notion of freedom, like freedom from constraint or freedom from coercion, not being manipulated. Like if a person is being manipulated and they decide based off of that manipulation, then they're not really being autonomous at that point. So autonomy's got that notion of freedom from hindrances, freedom from constraints. And then moral in this context is like, it's a moral agent, meaning that a person for deontologists is someone that does understand goods and bads, rights and wrongs. It's someone that can decide, yes, this is a good thing to do, or no, this is not a good thing to do. It's someone that has that sort of metaphorical moral compass. And then an agent is someone that's active. They can do, they can go, they have the ability to actually go out into the world and do stuff. So what does that imply? Like, are there some human beings that would not count as persons in this picture? Absolutely. Like people who are like a person that was, or a human that was irrational, like has an inability to critically think and analyze. That would not necessarily be a person on the deontological picture. That can be a little shaky, and at times with this particular theory, but this notion of persons, according to deontologists, is supposed to wrap around the most human beings. It may not capture all of them, but it does capture supposedly the most of us. The most just normal, typical adult human beings. But they're clearly like children. Like, think of young children. Would they have all of these traits as I've just described them? Likely not. Because a child is not necessarily totally autonomous, because the parents, we quarantine their world to a certain extent to try to protect them from harms, or we don't just typically let a child make whatever decision they happen to think is best at a given time, because they may not be ready to think through it. They may not have that amount of rationality necessary to think through the possible side effects. Like, the child may be like, yeah, this is great, this is fun, this is awesome, and that's the driver of their decision making. Whereas the parent comes in and builds a sort of barrier around that decision making and is like, well, okay, but there's more to life than just being fun. There's dangers. There's potential ways one could get hurt. And so a child tends not to be fully autonomous. So that means for a deontologist that one becomes a person. We don't enter the world as a person. Like, a fetus is not a person on the deontological picture. That adults are persons. It's just something to keep in mind about deontology. Now, this is, a sort of, there's different versions of deontology, but this kind of is the standard picture of it. And so what we're supposed to do is to always respect, persons, adults that have these traits. That's the core to morality as far as deontology people are concerned, is we respect other rational, willing, autonomous moral agents. And if we're doing that, we're morally in the good. If we are disrespectful, though, to persons, we are in the moral bad. But what exactly does it mean to respect somebody? And how does that work? Well, let's move forward and see if we can determine an answer to that. Well, for deontology, their answer to that original question, when is a specific action moral or immoral, their answer is that a specific action is moral when it's performed in accordance with one's duties. Otherwise, it's immoral. Well, duties, where does that come from? Is that, this is a duty. This always respect persons is the core duty that deontology people focus on. Is that is the duty. And so as long as a person is doing their duty, namely respecting persons, then they're moral. If they're not respecting persons, then they're immoral. And that's what it means to perform an action in accordance with one's duties, is to demonstrate this proper amount of respect for persons. But what does that actually mean? We need to keep going. How do we determine what it means to respect these persons? Well, the morality or immorality of actions is determined by reason and or intuition, not consequences. Okay, so reason and intuition, those are in the head notions. Those are like mental notions, like things that minds do, like people intuit, or they have like a sort of gut feeling. That sort of intuition, like, is something that a person will encounter a situation and it's like they seem to just know that, yeah, that's okay, or no, that's not okay. As well as with reason, that is not just being able to think through a complicated situation and offer reasons for one's actions or beliefs. It's more than that for deontology people, or at least for this one, Immanuel Kant, reason is much more. But we will move forward. This is the inherent nature of deontology. We introduce the notions, and then we have to move through the individual deontology people to make sense of those notions. Well, with Immanuel Kant, he was one of the sort of pride and privilege place first deontology people who went to the trouble to sort of formulate and lay out a theory of deontology. Is that here's the way it goes for someone like Immanuel Kant. Is say that I'm trying to decide what to do. Say that I'm trying to decide whether is it okay to, say, steal or not to steal. I mean, stealing just tends to be a good example for ethics. But so say that I'm trying to make that decision. Is it okay for me to steal from some other person? Well, Kant, the first thing he's going to say is, well, whatever you decide to do, you need to do it because it's your duty to do it. And so that's the first thing, is acting with a good will. And goodwill is just a motive, an intent. With this picture, this is what Kant has in mind when we're reading him this week in the textbook readings. The notion of a goodwill is just the notion of having the right motive or the right intent behind one's action. Like our action is being governed or driven forward by the right sort of outlook, the right intent, the right motive. Well, what is that right intent or right motive? Well, it's to do one's duty precisely, wholly, and solely because it's one's duty to do so. So regardless of how I decide on stealing, whether to do it or not, what I need to be doing in order to be the first step toward acting morally is whatever action I decide to do, my intent behind doing it should be, I'm doing this because it's my duty to do it. I'm doing it because it's what I'm obligated to do. Not because I necessarily want to do it, but because it's what morality and reason tells me I need to be doing. And so duties are dictated by reason. So whatever my reason says I am obligated to do in this decision of whether to steal or not, that's what I have to do. And I'm supposed to do. Reason dictates duties. It tells us what they are in any given situation. And reason is who we ultimately answer to for Kant. This is how he's a moral objectivist, is that reason is Kant's plus. Like that we plus, the plus could be humanity. It could be, like with consequentialist, it tends to be the best for the most. We answer to the consequences of our actions. How the calculation comes out, that's consequentialism's plus. That's what we ultimately answer to. Well, with Kant, it's reason. And so, what is reason for Kant? It's not just, like I said, just the ability to give reasons for our action. No, for Kant, reason is sort of like, and this is an analogy, but I think it's a good one to help people understand. Reason is like a special purpose program, software that lives in our minds. It is a program that we ask it what to do, and it decides for us. It tells us what the good thing to do would be. We consult reason. And that is exactly what it's like. It's like when you go to, say, a smartphone or a computer and you pull up the calculator program on the computer. That's a special purpose program. You pull up the calculator functionality in the phone or the computer, and you type in your numbers like 2, and then you hit plus, and then 2, and then the equal, and it tells you 4. That it pops 4 out for you. That's the way reason supposedly works for Kant too. I mean, this is analogous to what he comes up with. Then it's like we give it the data, the inputs, and then it pops out an output. It's like a function, like a mathematical function, where you push in certain inputs and then it maps it to a result as an output. And so it's a computator. It computes what would be good or bad to do. But how does that really work? We're still sitting there wondering about, okay, should I steal or not steal? Keep that in mind. What I've said, I haven't answered that question yet. All that I've done is just kind of giving you a sense that whatever we do, it has to be done in accordance with our duty. And then our duty is going to be determined by reason. And reason is like a piece of software in our head that we feed in our question to, and it hops out a result. Well, okay, so how does reason work? Well, it works. Kant comes up with what's known as like a categorical imperative, which imperative is just a command, which makes sense that reason's going to tell us what to do. It's going to dictate the terms to us. We ask reason what to do. It's going to tell us. That's who we answer to. So in a sense, we carry the moral judge around in our head all the time. It's a program running in our minds. And so just like the calculator program is on your phone, that reason is in our heads. I'm just using this analogy so that, and maybe that sounds weird to people, maybe it doesn't. But either way, it's a situation where that's exactly what it's like for Kant, is that reason is in everybody's head. It's a piece of software that's been installed in all of our brains across all of humanity. It doesn't play favorites with groups. It's just everybody has, in a sense, like imagine a world where every smartphone has exactly the same calculator program. Or imagine a world where every computer has, say, a Windows operating system. That there were no other operating systems, just all Windows all across the land. So every computer can, when you interact with it, you're interacting with Windows. Well, with Kant, these rational, willing, autonomous agents, persons, all have this reason piece of software in their mind. And so everybody can consult it when they come up to these situations. Should I steal or not steal? And, well, what Kant says is that the first test, reason's going to apply test to the situation. It's going to say, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is figure out what the maxim of the action, say, of stealing would be. So a maxim is just a sentence. It's just a principle that's governing that action. So I'm stealing because I want a bicycle. Say I'm stealing a bicycle, or I'm thinking about stealing somebody's bicycle, and I'm like, okay, I steal because I want a bicycle. And then there's a bicycle over there, I want it, so I steal it. That's kind of the maxims, the sentences that go along with that. Well, then Kant says what reason is going to do is try to universalize that maxim. And it's going to be, okay, so act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time, without contradiction, will that it should become a universal law. So how does that work? Well, reason's going to ask the question, could we universalize this maxim? Could we say this would be what it would be okay for all people to do, all rational, willing, autonomous agents to do? So the idea is I'm stealing because I want a bicycle. So to universalize, we would say, okay, everyone that wants a bicycle should steal it. Or everyone that wants anything should steal it. And that's what reason is going to try to do, is say, okay, could we in fact universalize a principle like that? Could we say it would be okay for everybody that wants something to just steal it? Not buy it, just steal it. Kant's going to say at that point, reason is going to run into a contradiction. Because if everyone were to steal whatever they want, whenever they want, then nobody would ever really have anything. Because there would be no notion of property. There would be no notion of ownership. And if there's not a notion of ownership, then there is no notion of stealing. You can't steal something that nobody owns. But if you tried to universalize everybody who wants something can steal it, it's okay for that to happen. Well, at that very moment, when reason tries to universalize that, when that piece of software in our head tries to do that, what it's going to see is that, well, if everybody, it's always okay for everybody to steal, well, then nobody could own anything because everybody'd be stealing everything all the time, or they could be. Remember, this is a sort of, an imagined scenario. But if it was okay for everybody to steal at any point, at any time, whenever they want, however they want, well, then nobody could ever really own anything. Because the notion of ownership depends on something like people being able to say, yeah, that's mine, that's not yours. Well, if no one can, if everybody stealing all the time undermines the notion of ownership, so there is nobody that owns anything anymore, well, then there's no way anybody could ever steal anymore. So now we get stealing and not stealing in the same scenario. Like if we try to universalize the notion of stealing for everybody, we end up with the result that nobody could in fact ever steal. So the very notion of stealing itself, it's like it eats itself. It contradicts. We end up with a cat and not a cat at the same time. We end up with stealing that results in no one can steal. And that is a sort of contradiction. I know that's a little sketchy to kind of think about, but hopefully people have a sense of how that contradiction mechanism is supposed to work with reason. What this piece of software is supposed to do is take our proposed action, try to universalize it, and say, what if everyone were to do this? Would this action still even be possible? And if it wouldn't even be possible if everybody were to do it, then we've reached a contradiction. And once we reach a contradiction, the result of reason is going to be, well, no, you shouldn't do that action because it's contradictory, it's incoherent, it does not work in the world. It's not going to work. And that's how we're supposed to get morality. Is that, and another example would be, say that a person's trying to decide, like, someone makes me mad, so I want to hurt them. I want to hit them in the eye or something. So my first thing is like, okay, Stephen is mad at someone, so Stephen wants to, hit whoever, Bob, in the eye. That's individual. Well, when I feed that to reason and say, would it be okay for me to hit Bob in the eye? I'm mad at Bob. I want to hurt Bob. Well, then reason's going to take that sort of maxim. Would it, it'd be okay for Stephen to hit Bob in the eye whenever he's mad at Bob. Well, then we universalize it. We say, would it be okay for anybody, anywhere, in any context, when they get mad, to hit somebody else in the eye? Well, reason's going to be, well, you could do that. You could do that. I mean, there's no immediate contradiction there. That hitting would still be hitting. That anger would still be anger. We haven't run into a contradiction of hitting people because we're angry results in nobody can ever hit anybody because they're angry, like we did with stealing. But we run in and we fall afoul to this notion of being able to will this into existence. So there's a twofold way that this works. The first way is reason test it for a contradiction. Like if we say everybody can steal, then the eventual result is no one would be able to steal. So stealing leads to no stealing, and then that supposedly is a contradiction. According to Kant, at least. I'm not saying that all of this is perfect. It's just the way Kant came up with it. But then the idea of everybody hitting somebody in the eye when they're angry, we may not run into a contradiction with that, but what we probably would run into a problem with is that reason would say, would you really will that into existence, though? Would everybody be willing to will that it's always okay to hit someone in the eye whenever you're angry with that person? Kant's going to wager that reason would say no, that everybody is not going to be okay with that. Remember, we're talking about rational, willing, autonomous moral agents. And so the idea is, would all rational, willing, autonomous moral agents readily be, will that it's okay to always hit people that make us mad? Probably not. It doesn't seem like we've done that in the world we actually live in. It seems, in fact, to go the other way around. Like we have laws that say, oh, that's assault, that's battery, that's bad. And so, so even though it doesn't lead to a contradiction necessarily, this maxim of I hit people when I'm angry, it still falls afoul of this other part of this universal law formulation where not everybody, with reason, remember, it's the same piece of software across everybody. So it has to have like this universal consent. And everybody's not going to consent to that. And so reason's going to work the same in everybody too. So the program of reason itself is going to say, no, hitting Bob in the eye because Stephen's angry, so he hits Bob in the eye, that's not morally okay because it cannot be universalized and universally willed by everybody else running this piece of software. So it's morally bad. Then, well, speaking of software, give me a warning 2 times. Good. That's how the universal law formulation of what's known as this categorical imperative works. And reason, is using this as the test. Like reason test, the idea is, I'm thinking about stealing a bicycle. Is that okay to do? Reason is going to say, no, that's not okay to do, because when we try to universalize it, it would lead to a contradiction of stealing itself would cease to be. So the very action you would say to do is self-defeating. Well, then, or when it comes to hitting someone when we're angry, it's not that we lead to a contradiction, but that not everybody running this reasoning program, being rational, willing, autonomous moral agents, they're not all going to consent to everybody can hit anybody in the eye whenever they're angry. So that's how hitting someone in the eye supposedly fails. Well, lying and false promising is another example. Kant uses this one a lot. And it works because it generates a pretty neat contradiction where, say that you're contemplating lying to someone, or even better yet, false promising. Like, say that someone says, hey, can you be here and help me do this at a certain day and time? And you're like, and you already know that you're not going to be there. You know this. And yet you say, yeah, I'll be there. That's a false promise. You know before you ever get started and make the promise that you're not going to follow through with it. That's what's involved in making a false promise or lying. So, let's hand that to reason. This piece of software in our heads. And so reason, the first thing it would do is try to universalize it. It would say, it's okay to lie. Anytime, for anybody, anyhow, any when, in any circumstance. It would be okay for everyone to lie whenever they want, however they want, whatever. Well, reason is going to say, if that were to be true, then we would lose all notion of truth telling. That if it's okay for lying to happen anytime, anywhen, for any reason, if that actually is okay, then no one could ever be sure that they weren't being lied to. So the whole notion of lying versus telling the truth ceases to have any meaning. The very notion of lying would make the whole notion of truth telling impossible, or to be able to determine if the truth is in play. And if that's the case, then we're not really able to lie anymore. That if everybody's always lying, then nobody's lying. Because lying would make the notion of truth meaningless. We would never have any notion of truth. And if that's the case, then we have no notion of lying. If there's nothing true, then there is no lies. There's no faults. That's a neat kind of contradiction. And so, how would that work with reason? Would it be okay for, me to lie? Well, no. Why? Because it would undermine the very notion of truth-telling. And that is something that most rational, willing, autonomous agents are not going to be willing to let go. And that would be your case of how the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, which is just, categorical just means it has an absolute quality to it. Reason is giving a dictate. It's a yay or a nay. And it's universal in the sense that we try to apply, that reason tries to apply whatever we ask it to everybody in all places and all times. And then it generates an imperative as the result, namely, no, it's not okay to lie, do not lie. Or no, it's not okay to steal, do not steal. Or do not make false promises. That's the sort of imperative that pops out of this universal law analysis. But then there's an analysis that reason also performs that tends to be more straightforward, that people tend to be able to make more sense out of. The universal law formulation, I'll be the first to say, it's a little tricky to make sense of what's actually going on there with Kant. And that's okay. That if it seems a little sketchy to you, you're not alone. That many contemporary philosophy people and ethicists still struggle with making sense of what Kant was trying to say there. But the one that test that reason performs that most every theorist and ethicist tends to be able to understand, or at least feel like we understand, is this test, this end in itself. And so the sort of principle that reason runs off of, besides the universal law, is act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And so positively stated, you always respect and treat persons as ends in themselves. That is, treat them in ways that befit their status as rational, willing, autonomous, moral agents. Or negatively stated, it's never treat a person, yourself included, as a mere means to an end. So, what's involved in that? Well, we can go back to stealing and say, would it be okay for me to steal a bicycle just because I want it? Well, we have to ask, well, how is that treating the owner of the bicycle? Is that being very respectful to that owner? Well, most people immediately kind of have a sense that no, that's not very respectful to take something that someone else spent their time and labor and money to acquire, stealing and then taking that from them with no compensation. That seems quite disrespectful. Taking something that doesn't belong to us seems disrespectful. But not only that, according to Kant, what reason would tell us is that when we steal, we're just treating someone else as if they're a tool. They are being treated as a tool. They are a means, a mere means to whatever end, little selfish desire we have. We're like, okay, I don't, this person has something, I want it. Well, thanks to them, they have it there. They made it convenient for me. That's their only purpose, to provide me with what I want when I want it, so I steal it from them. I take it. That's just treating that person as an object, as a thing. It's not treating them as a rational, willing, autonomous, moral agent. It's not treating them as a person. It's treating them as a mere thing. That's what it means to treat someone as a means, a mere means to our own ends, and not treating them as an end in themselves. Like when we treat someone as an end in themselves, we see them as an equal. That person has the same rights, same entitlements. They've mixed the same amount of labor to acquire the things they have as you or me or anyone else has. And so we are supposed to respect them as ourselves. We have to have self-respect as well as other respect on this picture. That's what reason, the piece of software, that's the way it operates in our minds, according to Kant, is that if we ask, would it be okay for me to steal this other person's bicycle? Reason is going to tell us no. Why? Well, because it would be treating that person as a mere means to your end. It would not be treating them as an equal, as an end in themselves. And that is, but it also works with lying. Like if we could ask, take the maxim, it's okay for me to lie to someone when I need to. Well, is that okay? We hand that to reason. Reason's going to be, well, it's going to first try to universalize it. It's going to fail on the universalizing thing. But moreover, lying would fail on this too, this test. Because if we lie to someone, then we are typically manipulating them or we're enabling them to believe something that's not true. And when we do that, we hinder their autonomy. We directly impact their autonomy, their ability to freely make an informed decision. And in doing that, we're treating them as a mere means. Like, we're not trying to help their autonomy. We're not doing anything. In a sense, we're saying, well, I don't really care that you can't make an informed decision. I'm just going to do what I want. You're just a tool to help me get there. That's how lying fails the end in itself test. That it is treating a person as a mere means to some end. I lie so that this person does whatever I want them to do. And so it's kind of like, it's the same as I pick up a shovel to go dig a hole in the yard. That's the end that I'm after is the hole in the yard. The shovel is the means of getting that hole in the yard. It's the tool. I don't really think of the shovel as an equal, as something worthy of respect. No, I just see it as a tool, and if it, and if it breaks, well, I throw it down, I get another tool, I buy another shovel. And I don't sit and contemplate, does this hinder the shovel's ability to do other things? No, well, shovels are not people. They're not rational, willing, autonomous agents. But according to the way Kant describes reason, that reason does pay attention to people. That it's a specifically designed program in our heads to be keenly aware that actions actions and motives, and the motives of those actions can directly impact, affect the rational, willing, autonomous moral agents. And so if we are not giving due respect by our actions to whoever's being acted upon, then the end in itself formulation of reason is going to say, no, that's bad. So that is the sort of Kantian picture of deontology. So let's run through this again. How does this work? An action is good insofar as we're doing our duty. Well, we have this prime duty, like duty primus. Always respect autonomous, rational, willing, moral agents. Well, how do we know whether an action we're wondering about is going to do that or not? Well, we ask reason. And reason's going to subject our proposed action. First, it's going to try to universalize it and say, would it be okay for everyone to do this? Or what is the result of if everyone were to do this? If that leads to a contradiction, that, if you were to do this, if you were to try to universalize stealing and stealing becomes impossible, that's contradiction. Reason is going to hop out the result. No, you don't do that. That would not be acting in accordance with your duty to respect others or yourself. It just contradicts human behavior entirely. So no, you don't steal. That would be bad. And reason is going to subject it to this end in itself formulation and say, okay, with stealing, would you be treating someone as a mere means to an end? And it's going to say, yes, you would be. So no, you don't do that. That's bad. That's the way reason is supposed to work. And, well, whatever reason says, then you act on that. You do your duty precisely, wholly and solely, not because you want to, but because it's what reason said you need to do. If reason says don't do that, well, you don't do that. And that not doing something is itself an action because you're choosing not to do it. And as long as you're choosing not to do it because reason said so, you're moral. That's acting with a good will. You have done what your reason has instructed you to do. And you did it not necessarily, maybe you really wanted to steal, or maybe you really wanted to lie, but you didn't. And the reason you didn't is because reason said you shouldn't do it. So you've obeyed reason. That means you acted morally. You did your duty. And your duty, our prime obligation, is to respect other persons, which is like what reason, that's like reason's prime command. It's what it's going to always default to. Regardless of what it tells us to do, we could always be assured that whatever it says is going to be tailored to giving other rational, willing, autonomous moral agents the respect that is due to them. So that is Kant.